Welcome to Purpose 360. I'm Carol Cohn.
And I'm Chris Noble.
And we're on a journey to explore the brightest and most innovative minds and initiatives in social purpose.
Today, companies and brands must stand for something meaningful. They have to have a social purpose and bring that purpose forward to their employees, their customers, and their community.
Each episode, we're talking to leaders at Fortune 100 companies, global brands, social enterprise startups, NGOs, and everything in between.
We'll be taking a deep dive to learn how they are integrating purpose into their organizations
to benefit both business and society for enduring impact. Join us. Today, we have a special treat for you. Martin Whittaker, CEO of Just Capital, just returned from Davos a week ago, and we really wanted to continue our conversation with him about how Just Capital is advancing the stakeholder-based capitalism movement through their definitive data and rankings to help companies benchmark and improve performance, as well as making the business and investment case to incentivize change. I love in Just Capital's 2019 recap, which I suggest anybody should look at, and we'll put it in our show notes, that you said this absolutely very well stated point. 2020 will be the year business and markets move from rhetoric to reality, from aspiration to action. Show me will be the operative phase. So I know that, Martin, you went to Davos for the first time and you were busy. You had over 3 formal events. You're a first-timer at Davos. It's their 50th anniversary year. The theme was a cohesive and sustainable world. So what was your first impression about being in that beautiful location with such substantive issues?
So it's thank you, Carol, and thank you for having me on the podcast. The event at Davos to me was like many other sort of large events now. I didn't get the sense that I was having sort of such a unique experience in an elite, high-powered environment. I felt like it was a big convening of lots of people from the corporate and financial and the policy worlds coming together to talk about big global issues. Obviously, it's not my first time at a big event or a big conference, so it had many of the hallmarks that anyone listening to this who's been to large events would recognize. I think what made it special was you're in this place where it's really hard to get to. Security are everywhere. It's sort of, you're aware of the presence of world leaders, but if you're normal like me, you really don't get to hang out with them. So it's almost as much, the rumors about what was happening at Davos were just as rife in Davos as they were, as they are when you're not in Davos. So there's a lot happening. The bulk of the folks there, I felt like because you're in this environment which is pretty self-contained for a few days, people tend to open up. You tend to have really easy access to folks, and things come together because people want them to come together. So there's a mindset about getting things done. I felt it was a really sort of breath of fresh air in terms of a desire to really try and do something substantial and serious and not just talk. So that was the biggest, I've been to many, many events where I've come away thinking, not sure that was worth the trip or that was a great, conversation, but what actually happens when you get back to work? I felt like this was more substantive than that. So that was good.
Talk about your events. And so you had a formal event with WEF, and certainly as a world leader in evolving in capitalism, I mean, you are a leader. And so can you, how was the event? I know that Paul Tudor Jones was speaking at that event. How was your premise accepted?
Yeah, so it was very good because what we were talking about was one of the core themes of the entire event, and something that Klaus Schwab, is central to his vision of a stakeholder economy. So the work we've been doing over the last 6 years at Just Capital sort of was front and center not just on the agenda, but really in the DNA of what WEF is trying to accomplish. So Paul did a formal event on the main stage at the Congress Center with the global president and CEO of EY, Carmine DeCivio. That was moderated by Sarah Williamson from FCLT and focusing capital on the long term. And then we had a breakfast moderated by the FT, Andrew Edgecliffe Johnson, with Carmine and Paul. That was at one of the hotels, extremely well attended breakfast. And, where we really had this conversation about what are we seeing, what is EY seeing. Now, of course, EY is one of the big four that had embraced WEF's metric system, that simplified standard for trying to measure corporate stakeholder performance, which was launched during that week. So we had a good inside look at what that was. We talked about at a high level why it's important and what Just Capital is doing to measure companies on that. We looked at it from the investor standpoint. We also had an event with Forbes. My colleague Alison Omans spoke at that with Paul, the CEO of Verizon, and Randall Lane from Forbes.
And they're your partner for the Just 100.
Yeah, exactly. So Forbes and Just launched the Just 100 every year together. That gave us a strong formal program. That around that, I know Paul attended 3 or 4 dinners and other events, including the New York Times dinner, which was one of the highlights, I think, of the whole week, with Andrew Ross Sorkin and Dan Schulman from PayPal. I attended another PayPal dinner, a dinner with Axios. So a lot of these small-sided, and by small-sided I mean sort of 15 to 25 people events as well, where major themes were discussed.
So rate the conversations there, big venues, smaller venues, probably also some, meeting somebody on the street or a hotel lobby. But how do you move from aspiration to action?
Well, I think the message that we were sort of hammering home, which I think spoke to that, was, first of all, we need to agree on how how are we actually going to measure a stakeholder economy? What does it even mean? And of course, that's what we've been doing. So we were one of the few organizations to be able to bring concrete data to the table, to be able to say, we are measuring companies on the public and what they feel. So we were able to connect this aspiration of stakeholder behavior right down to, Main Street America and what ordinary folks sort of think of that, what do they think that means? And that was very refreshing. There are very few, I think, organizations bringing forth this sort of bottom-up approach of trying to harness, the general public's support for this. So we weren't sort of quibbling in the clouds around metrics and which standards and who had the better framework. This was sort of like, no, this is what the public want. And then to be able to put data behind that. So I'll give you a concrete example. WEF's, the International Business Coalition, the group that had developed the simplified framework, we've already been covering 20 of the 22 issues that they identified. We have data going back several years. So we were able to sort of talk about actual performance of companies on those things. And so I was going to a meeting, had, the research team here in New York conduct work to help us figure out, well, let's have a look at how big companies are actually doing on these things and then present that data at the meeting. Once you start to begin to put up a league table or to be able to put up data that shows what companies are actually doing, you tend to get action. It tends to motivate a response. And the last thing I'd say on that is my sense, Carol, just working the hallways and the receptions and in the evening, people have had a drink or two and are trying to open up, was that people really were tired of the endless talk around different ways to move forward and different approaches and frameworks. It was it was time for action. And we were at several events one night where it just seemed to be sort of, I think people's patience just running very close to the end where, okay, we need to move forward. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's develop a simple way to try and just begin to measure progress and then to begin to hold companies and other actors in this to account.
Can you say, even if it's not the company, it might be an industry, anything really concrete that came out of your discussions or presentations?
Well, we've been talking to a small number of companies around conducting a financial distress test. How many of your employees are under, living in a state of acute financial distress? And we discussed that at the PayPal dinner, the PayPal lunch. Dan Schulman has been a champion of this. We talked about that. We showcased his work, I think, for the first time on this issue on CNBC Squawk Box. That became the talk of Davos, or what Dan is doing. That turned into, okay, great. How can other companies emulate that? And so there was a conversation that where this notion of, okay, well, why don't we create a movement around that? Why don't we have companies commit to conducting among their employee base a simple distress test, just so that people know how many of their employees are in this situation, and then you can figure out what, if anything, to do about it.
And did you get companies to sign up?
We're in the process of doing that right now, Carol. Literally,
right.
We know that PayPal wants to champion this. We're working with them to try and put a program together. We know that Paul Jones, our chair, is very much behind it, because at the end of the day, it's such a good test of whether we really do have a just economy or not. When people talk about stakeholder performance, Business Roundtable signatory CEO, you've just said to the world that your purpose, your very purpose, is to create value for all your stakeholders. Your workers, we know, are, certainly according to our research, your most important stakeholder, because without them, not a lot gets done, quite honestly. If you have employees and you're a Fortune 500 company, and you have employees that are still relying on government support and food stamps to make ends meet, shame on you. And so I think that sort of stands out as being a very simple, just a test case of how this all comes together in glorious sort of technicolor, right? Like, if that's just not fair, that cannot be a situation where, we feel proud about the economy that we've built, if that's the norm. So just dealing with that one issue. So that's I give you that as a concrete example of something that, practical thing companies can do, leaders can do those things, and there are real human beneficiaries on the other side.
Did you go to Davos with that idea already percolating?
We went. Yeah, we did. We went to Davos with the message that we want to bring the voice of the public to Davos, because that's who we represent. We knew that this was a really important issue. We know from our own research that there are many, many workers at Russell 1000 companies that are suffering, and we felt like this is where the rubber hits the road. So yeah, we have that as a program idea. We went there to sort of figure out, quite honestly, does this have legs? Are we sort of like just drinking our own Kool-Aid here, or is this something that is real? No, I got the sense that absolutely. Every time I talked about that, I mentioned that at dinners. We talked about this in the hallways, and people just loved that idea. So I think we can turn that into something real, but it's something that crystallized, I think, as a real thing at Davos for us.
How many companies do you feel you need to have commit to that so that you can then say, okay, we're ready to launch?
It's a great question. I hesitate to put a number, because it looks like we don't hit that number, then we fail.
But are we talking 10? Are we talking 100? Somewhere in between?
No, I think we're talking 10, not 100. The whole thing about just is change at scale. That's why we focus on big corporations. So we want companies, that it might be uncomfortable for them because they may have larger numbers of employees that fall into that category, or the path forward on what to do might not be clear. But we live in a time where courage is needed, and people have to have the courage of their convictions. And so, unfortunately, asking these uncomfortable, questions is what is needed. So I think if we got the right 10 or 12 or 8 companies and the right CEOs willing to say, you know what, we're going to do this, it could really turn into a movement where you get 100 very quickly.
Did you hear of any other real action-oriented ideas that were being either floated or signed on to at Davos, beyond yours?
Oh, there were so many. I mean, the climate was another area of major activity. Greta was there. It was a major topic of debate. There wasn't one CEO who sort of seemed willing to do anything other than everything that was needed to save the climate. So it's sort of like, it felt like there was a lot of heady talk about addressing that issue and lots of commitments. We saw a lot of individual companies using Davos to make announcements about things that they were doing. Lots on that theme. Gender issues and gender equity issues, very important throughout as well. Davos is not the most representative stage in terms of women participation, minority participation in the formal or the informal stages. So that's something that I know WEF wants to be better at. But I think there were honestly tons of, really strong, passionate ideas and really cool stuff. But I felt like Just was at the vanguard. I felt like we were there with a lot of humility because, I would travel with a couple of colleagues as well as Paul. And we wanted to listen as much as speak. And we really wanted to sort of get a sense of, are we too far off here? Are we out? Is the polling result that we're getting from the polling, is that taking us off in a direction that doesn't feel doable? But none of those things felt right. I felt like I came back very emboldened that we were on the right path. And actually the American sort of contingent there was not behind the curve. I hear this a lot, and this is maybe counterintuitive, that the rest of the world is way further ahead on a lot of issues. It may be true on things like climate politically, but I got the sense that actually we are not behind on our thinking on really how to move markets in support of stakeholder capitalism. I didn't feel as though we were somehow catching up. I felt as though we have a real chance of leadership, and that forget about your politics. I just felt like everyone there realized that the business is going to be better. We need to get the pie growing for more people. That's an essentially American thing. And that actually was a vision that the rest of the world could learn from America from, as opposed to America playing catch up.
So that seemed like a surprise to you.
I guess now I'm talking about it somewhat. Yeah. One always presumes that we're behind here because we get consumed with our own domestic agenda, which is very powerful and very divisive and very emotive right now. And when you step into the international stage, you get a perspective on that. I've felt pretty good about our understanding of the issues, and I felt like we were talking about things which really were going to move the needle on the international stage, and that getting it right here really could provide leadership for the rest of the world.
Did you find any other analogs of other organizations that are like Just Capital, but they're operating in other countries?
Many folks focus on individual issues that were doing phenomenal work. There was a group focused on human rights and the impact that big companies are having on cultural sites of cultural importance and relevance around the world. So lots of very, very important but narrower issue-specific groups working on really important things. I didn't feel as though I encountered anyone who was really trying to address core systemic problems and having the kind of influence that I hope we're having, and that we want to have a lot more of.
Now that you've gone through Davos and with a lot of momentum behind stakeholder-based capitalism, what would you do? What are you going to do next year?
I realize that there are lots of media and large corporations who really value thought leadership on all the issues that we're tracking. So next year, I would really begin to try and create a stronger coalescence on a program or a program work that brought together some of the big players, as opposed to, I felt like we did that a little bit, but it is a place where people's mindsets are different, and I think there is room. And next year will be interesting. Of course, we'll either be living under the beginning of a new Trump administration or a new Democrat administration, and so the world will be different in that regard, coming at it from an American perspective. So I think next year will be, either way you look at it, if you did a little bit of scenario planning, all about what is business supposed to do in this new reality. Is the pendulum really swung back, or are we now really more focused on business having to do more? So it'll be very interesting to see where we end up. But I know that next year, I think putting together a more orchestrated program of events on one thing, so you could say, this is the specific concrete action that is now coming out of Davos, not necessarily being just sort of launched without context at Davos. That's what I would focus on, and we have some ideas on what that could be.
And how about 3 recommendations for companies who they've been going to Davos, but to go from rhetoric to reality?
Well, I think Davos just becomes a place where that is showcased. It doesn't replace what you do day in, day out, week in, week out. I wouldn't. I don't think my advice would be any different than if it was, if we weren't talking about Davos, which is moving from rhetoric to reality requires you to identify goals, set targets, measure what matters, and then be transparent and accountable and disclose data so that people can see what you're doing. That's what Just is doing day in, day out ourselves, measuring companies on these things. I think when it comes to an occasion like Davos, you could say, okay, what do we really stand for? What are our objectives? How can we create something bigger than ourselves and use Davos as a way to create momentum behind that? Would I go again? Absolutely. Did I think it was time well spent? Completely. The secret is to just put yourself out there. Once you get there, you can figure a lot out. We ended up going to events and being able to get invitations to activities where we had no, we did not plan for, which turned out to be incredibly fruitful. So if you can find a way to just get there, then you can really make things happen if you're resourceful.
How far has your reputation traveled in terms of on a global basis with these leaders?
It's hard to say, Carol. I just like to think that we're on the map. I think what we're doing is relevant. I sense a huge opportunity. I think if Just can get the right, sense of, if we can get the right partnerships together, the right resources behind the organization, we have a shot. Obviously, we're not the panacea. We need to work with others to do this. But I feel like, the world is sort of waking up to this idea that we've got to do things a little differently. And stakeholder capitalism is not it's not some big scary thing. It's actually quite doable, and there's a lot in it for everybody. So yeah, no, I'm very optimistic coming back.
Well, that's good. And then how does this make you feel professionally?
This is just, for me, I guess, a validation of the mission of the organization. I feel as though the hard work that the team is doing here is really paying off, and there's a fulfillment, a sense of fulfillment around that. But work is never done. This is a big opportunity. I feel the time is now, and we have a real responsibility to grasp it. So it's good. It's good to be out, talking to high level folks about how to really begin to move to action. But ultimately, this comes down to just grinding it day in, day out, and making sure that it happens.
Well, I think the movement is very, very fortunate to have you leading it and through Just Capital. Obviously, there are other leaders. I know, here's one last question, which is unrelated to Davos, but I've been asked this by large privately held companies. Your data follows public companies, and the large private ones say, when will you start following private companies?
It's just a resource question, Carol. We could begin to follow private companies once we're able to get sort of a clearer picture on how to do that at scale. What I'm not a fan of is a piecemeal response. If we're going to begin to do that, it needs to be done in a way that is scalable. That requires resources. As a CEO, it's not responsible of me to sort of take us in a direction unless I can really see that long term this is going to lead to large scale success. The other thing I'll say to that is, if there are private companies that listen to this who really do, want to be examined, or feel as though the Just framework could benefit them, be of value to them, we do have a toolkit, and we do have the ability to say, we'll make our data and our framework available to you, and then you can benchmark yourselves. So we're not going to be necessarily, it's not easy for us to begin to cover private companies on a piecemeal basis, but one-on-one, if private companies said, look, I want to see how I do. I want to know, do I compare well or poorly, or what does best practice look like in my industry on these things? We absolutely can help them. So any private company listening to this that, wants to sort of benchmark itself, reach out to me, and let's figure out how to do that.
That's terrific. And I know that also publicly held companies who want to understand their rankings, the Just 100 index, that you are always just so gracious about having them reach out to you to learn more. So I want to thank you. I know we snuck this in. I know you're really, really busy following Davos, but this is actually a great conversation. Thank you so much. You're a wonderful standard bearer for stakeholder-based capitalism, and also for bringing the voice of the public to Davos, and also the fact that you brought something very specific. We're going to keep our eye out for the financial distress test. And we'll ask you periodically how that's going. Once you announce it, we'd love to have you back on the show. And again, thank you very much for all that you're doing, Martin Whittaker.
Thank you, Carol. The pleasure and the privilege is all mine.